Olá, bem-vindo, bem-vinda à série de vídeos do Meeting de Negociação. E nesse vídeo aqui você vai ver a Masterclass, que aconteceu durante a cerimônia de abertura do Meeting de Negociação 2020, que aconteceu inteiramente online em função dos desafios do momento. Então aproveite, desfrute e aguardamos você nas próximas edições. 7 minutes have passed, so we can start the masterclass. And first, we would like to thank you, Giuseppe, to have accepted our invitation to be here with us. It's a true honor to have your energy, to have your presence with us, to have Italy straight from New York with us today. That's amazing. So I will let Marcelo give the honors to receive you with us. And please be welcome. I will be here quiet, just listening to your class. Marcelo, with you now.
Okay, can we start? Thank you, Camille. I will present our guest. And please, it's really a short bio, but I want to present Mr. De Palo for all of you, because I think it will also help when we have some questions and to know his experience and background may help. Well, Mr. Giuseppe De Palo is Italian. He's the Ombudsman for the United Nations Funds and Programs. His team, based in New York City, is tasked with helping prevent and resolve work-related disputes within UNDP, UNICEF, UNFPA, UNOPS, and UN Women. During his career, Mr. De Palo has contributed to the resolution of over 2,500 disputes, mediating cases in more than 60 countries, and dealing with parties over 90 different nationalities. Before joining the UN, Mr. De Palo was chairman of the board of ADR Center, one of the largest providers of mediation service in Europe. Concurrently, he served as director of GEMS International, a subsidiary of GEMS, the largest private provider of alternative dispute resolution service in the world. Mr. De Palo started his academic career in 1995 and in 2002 became the International Professor of Alternative Dispute Resolution Law and Practice at Mitchell Hamline School of Law, where he taught courses in negotiation, advanced negotiation, and cross-cultural negotiation. Mr. De Palo has provided expert advice to national and supranational parliaments, as well as advised the ministers of justice and economics of several countries on dispute resolution policy. He was written extensively on mediation, and some of his publications have been translated into multiple languages. Mr. De Palo is a graduate of law schools at the University of Bologna and the University of California, Berkeley. He also has a degree in political science from the University of Urbino. This is really a short bio if we consider all of your experience and knowledge through all these years. Thanks, my friend, to accept our invitation. Thanks to be here with us today. I want to thank you, Ossio Tissot, for the translation to English, and thanks Marta Dias for the translation to Portuguese. So now, Professore Giuseppe De Palo, adesso è vostra la parola. I think you are on mute.
Unmute. Muito obrigado, fratello Marcelo. Thank you to you, thank you to Camille, Harry, to all the organizers and all the students. I had promised Marcelo and Camille that I would speak Portuguese. Unfortunately, I work around the world and was not able to prepare. But I made them a promise that I'll make to you right now. If I do this again, I'll try to speak Portuguese. If I speak too fast today in English, for the translator, something is not clear, please somehow send me a text, raise your hand, send me a WhatsApp, so I will adjust and slow down. But hopefully you'll be able to follow. One of the reasons why I thought that English would be okay is because my understanding is that this competition will select a team that will go on and participate to the international stage. And therefore, I think you have to practice English. Like for me, this is not my first language. But leaving that aside, let me dive into the subject matter, and let me see if I'm able to share the screen of the presentation I have prepared for you today. Is this visible? It seems like it's okay. Can you see that, right? Excellent. Okay. Before we get there, maybe it's not the right one. My apologies. Bear with me just for a second. No, this is not what I want to share. Don't say what I want to share. Is here. I promise you that I had prepared to do this without glitches. Yes, I'm there. Can you see the presentation now? You can? No. Can you now? Okay, bear with me, I will be there. I promise I will make it. This is the one. Okay, I believe now it's okay, right? Excellent. Marcelo said that I should come to Brazil, and I really like to do it. And I know that most speakers would say, yes, I would like to come, I would like to see you. But when I say that I missed the opportunity of being with you, it's true. This is a picture of about 10 years ago. When I came to Brazil, I was still working for ADR Center and JAMS, as you can see. And Marcelo organized a series of conferences in Brazil. So as you can see, that poster is huge. I've never had such a welcome when you see my picture. And so the hospitality of Brazil has been great to me. So when I say that I miss being with you, you should believe that I really mean it. The other reason why I like to show this picture is because of the similarity between the two of us. I don't know if Marcelo looks young today or looked old 10 years ago. It kind of looks the same, but we also kind of look alike, because a true joke about this picture, when I showed it here in the United States, somebody looked at Marcelo in the picture with jeans and the blue and look at me and said, wow, Giuseppe, you're very slim, you're very fit. Who is your personal trainer? I want to have the personal trainer. So my American friend thought that Marcelo was me, but it was not. Having said that, as a personal note, I want to talk about the issue of theories, plural, and practice, singular. The reason is because this is a negotiation competition, a negotiation course, and chances are that because of your students you're preparing and you have experience, you might even know more than I do as far as negotiation theories go these days. When I started exactly 25 years ago, most of the negotiation theory came from the East Coast of the United States, especially from Massachusetts, Boston's, the Harvard School of win-win, of getting to yes. At the same time, on the West Coast of the United States, there was another school of thought, mostly run by psychologists who studied cognitive biases and how we make decisions in the face of uncertainty, which is very common in negotiation. If you don't take a proposal, if you do not accept the settlement, what will happen, right? There is uncertainty there. Then new theories came on board. The negotiation theory of the 7 elements: interest, options, communication, relationship, and things like that. And even more recently, the theory of the 3 tensions between creating value and distributing value, principal and agent, and empathy and assertiveness. I'm sure that there are lots of theories around negotiation, but I will leave them to you as students. Today, I would like to bring a connection between those theories that you know and other theories that are not normally studied by negotiation scholars or students, but they are extremely important to you as you prepare, first of all, for an international negotiation competition, but also to become negotiators in the broader world, in your real life, in real practice. So I would be proposing you a merge, a convergence between certain elements of a negotiation theory that you know, with theories in the field of cultural anthropology, studying how people behave, communicate, and negotiate across culture, and see if that can be of any value to you. So we will have a framework, some principles, some concepts, because there are many theories about negotiation. I chose the one that is most convincing, that is most useful to me. And we see if that can can give you some practical tools, some practical ways to deal with negotiation questions and dilemma you will have tomorrow if you're dealing with an Italian, with an American, with a German, with a Chinese. Okay, so that's kind of the plan. I hope you will have questions for me. So the organizer are kindly taking notes of those questions. They will be translated for me. Let's say toward the end, but if there are some pressing questions, the organizer will stop me and you'll stop me, and I will try to answer those questions on the spot. I hope that makes sense. Now, when I talk even here at the United Nations, people sometimes wonder, is the culture discussion nowadays as important as it was many years ago? We have internet, we have Netflix. Before the pandemic, it was relatively easy to fly across cultures. We read the same books, we watch the same TV. Does culture really matter today as it did a number of years ago? Or being part of a flat world, the liquid society, makes those differences in national cultures less relevant today? What's the value for negotiators if we all read and apply the principles of getting to yes, right? Why do we need to worry about being Swedish or being French? Let's take a look at this to see if this is true, if this is really a concern of you as the negotiators of this time. The culture I want to talk to you about, look at this other culture, are people who are relaxed, friendly, spontaneous, uninhibited, emotional, and impulsive. Think for a second from your Brazilian perspective, what is a culture in the world that fits this profile? You meet those people and they tend to be, we're all diverse, but we tend to be Brazilians, Italians, American, relaxed, friendly, spontaneous, uninhibited, emotional, and impulsive. I'll give you a second to think about it. Who could they be? If you have not traveled abroad, you might see them in movies, you might have read them in books and stuff like that. Okay, now think about, I would say, kind of the opposite. This is a different culture, and they are always in a hurry. They're serious, reserved, restrained, composed, and methodical, right? You could say these are two different cultures. Well, they're not, If you ask a Japanese to describe an American, they would say, the Japanese say that an American is friendly, spontaneous, emotional, impulsive. But if you ask the Mexicans, right, they would look at the same culture in different ways. So you can see that also in defining culture, we use lenses, right? How can it possibly be that the same culture, Americans, are described so differently? I would say almost the opposite by others, okay? This seems to suggest that culture is there. We have groups, Japanese, Mexicans, that think in the same way, and I would say in very different ways about the same object. The object is the American, this particular example. This is a more scientific, if you will, way of accessing culture. A question was asked, a very simple question was asked to many people, right, to many managers. And the question was, is it important for a manager to have at hand, to have immediately precise answers to the questions that supervisees, the subordinates have about their work? And when you ask this question to Japanese, almost 80% will tell you, yes, for you to be a manager, you have to have the answers, precise answers. Go down to Sweden. In Sweden, people say manager does not have to have the questions necessarily. He or she can be a good manager without having that. So see the differences in this chart. So as you can see, the cultural lens, the lens also provides answers to questions in a very different way, right? The final examples I want to show to you to see the importance of culture is this survey that was done a few years ago by PricewaterhouseCoopers. And the question was, what are the challenges that United States and European senior executive face when they manage across different countries? And people would normally think, if you are a Brazilian company, if you want to open in Italy, in the United States, that you would have issues with tax differences, employment laws, but you can see how high is the importance of cultural difference. Is the second highest concern. So this is a real problem. It's not something theoretical, it's not something abstract, it's something practical as well. Now, you might have traveling, working abroad, or just watching movies or reading books, experience what is referred to the cultural bias. Yeah? What we do is normal, is good, is the way it should be, and what is different is abnormal, is even bad. It's not just strange or weird, it's something bad. When we speak about culture, we must understand culture in the proper term. There are two ways that the word is used. In a narrow sense, when we say culture, we think about civilization, art, science, education. This is not the meaning in which culture is used in this context. In the anthropological sense, culture can be defined as the collective programming of the human mind. The collective programming of the human mind. How our mind, our brain is programmed, if a software, like you will, by the fact that we are raised in a society, in a particular group, okay? When we think about our childhood, when we're kids, we don't really know, we don't have experience. What is good, what is bad, what gets us to get a smile, to be rewarded, and what gets us to be yelled at. We don't know. We experience that by working first with, or being around our family, then going to the kindergarten, then to school. What we saw around us in our family is normal. And this is what shapes our perception, our understanding of the rules of the game. The social game, the being together, working together, right, has rules, and we learn those rules by being exposed as kids to certain inputs from the society we live in. Now, I haven't discussed it with Camille or Marcelo, but I want to try a little experiment, and it's very hard to do this online, but we'll try. I'd like to ask those of you whose last name goes from A to L to watch, and everybody whose last name, like my last name is De Palo, right, is from M, like Marcelo, to Z, not to watch, okay? Maybe I don't know if Marcelo Camille can repeat the exercise. I'm gonna ask only for a few seconds that those whose last name, only those whose last name begins with A or with L, to watch. M to Z should not watch. Is that okay? Can I get a sign, Marcel? Okay, all right. So it's gonna be very quick. So promise me, people with last name M to Z, not to look at the screen. Look away, okay? Don't look. Okay. So if your last name begins with A to L, be ready. I'm gonna give you 3 seconds, and I'm gonna ask you to think. Don't say anything. Don't write anything. Just think about what you see. Okay. 3, 2, 1, go. Okay. Now let's change group now. Thank you to the people with M to Z that were not looking. Now, people who with the last name from A to Z, those who watch, now is your turn. Do not watch, okay? Look away. We're just working with the people whose last name is M to Z. Same question to you. What do you see? Okay. Now everybody can watch, relax, okay? I'm gonna show to all of you something, and then I'm gonna ask you through the chat box, please, to respond to a question. Okay, again, we're improvising here, so be flexible and patient with us. So everybody can watch now. Okay, now I would like to ask now to the first group, A to L. What is it that you saw? I showed you one image and then another one. One just to all of you, to A to L, and then the second to everyone. Can you in the chat box write, please, what you saw? Okay, Marcelo, can you tell me what the people are saying to have seen?
A man with glasses,
and no hair. Okay.
Old persons.
An old person, a man. Okay, all right. It's a human being, yeah. Essentially. Okay, now let's stop. Let's speak to the second group, M to Z. What did they see? The second group.
A mouse.
A mouse. A rat.
Mouse.
So not a human being. A mouse. Okay. All right. Good.
Yeah. A rat.
Okay. Now, guys, this is what I showed you all. Right? To the first group, I showed the first picture on the top left. Right? To the AL, at the bottom to the left, I showed to the second group the second picture. But to all of you, I showed the image on the right. Right? Clearly, this is an optical illusion. In each picture, you can see the old man with glasses, but if you look at the bottom, you can also see the rat. What I'm trying to say is that I showed you the same thing, the same lines, but because how I changed the lines in the first picture, in the second picture, in the third picture, I was able to shape what you saw. If I, remotely, you don't know me, by showing you certain things, adding lines or taking out lines, I can shape your perception. Imagine what our parents can do to us, to our life, by telling us what's right and wrong, by giving us certain food and not giving us other foods, by being happy, by being tough, by being generous, by being selfless or selfish, right? By smiling or not smiling at us, by helping us or not helping us, just making sure that we help ourselves. This was just a little experiment to show you the power that you have to influence somebody else's view of things, okay? So perception is the key word. And sometimes people think about, speak about culture like having cultural lenses. You know, if my lenses are pink, I will see the entire world pink, right? Now, but I can take off my lenses and then there's no pink anymore. Or I could put on green lenses and the world becomes green, right? I like more the idea of a rhino painting because the rhino cannot take off his horn, right? So the horn is there, and anything the rhino sees, you see in the paintings, has the horn in there. It cannot take it off. And culture to me is something like that because it stays, it's solid, and you cannot take it out. You can realize, you can rationalize that you have a horn, right? But you cannot take it off. You cannot ignore your cultural background as you look at things and you make judgments and evaluations about those things. Now, as we analyze human behavior as a whole, this theory suggests that mankind, the humankind, men and women, no, not just mankind in terms of men, have three elements. We all share something common to humankind, is something that is inherited. We have the same brain, the same genes. We have the same desire for food, for love, fear, getting hurt. We have the sexual appetites. We have sexual desires. We want to create kids, right? These are things common throughout history, throughout ages, and throughout culture, right? If we are attacked, we respond to the attack or we escape. This is common throughout human history and is a common element that presumably we inherit, is in our DNA. Then we have something else on top of that, which is smaller. It's what we call culture in terms of collective by group. There are certain behaviors that are more common in certain groups. Why? Because we learn these behaviors by interacting with others. In our family, in our schools, in our workplace, and we learn about that. Then on top of that, we have something which is both inherited and learned, and is our individual behavior. We are all unique, and therefore we have characteristics that can be not very Brazilians, not very Italians. That's absolutely okay. We're not putting people into boxes. We're just looking at how groups behave. When we speak about national culture, we speak about what's in the middle, is in orange. And this is what we learn. So I am an Italian, right? My parents were Italian. But if I was raised in Papua New Guinea, right, in opposite side of the world by parents from Papua New Guinea, and my friends, my professor were from Papua New Guinea, I would not have any feature of the Italian culture, of course. So that is only learned. Does not depend on your parents, does not depend on your genes, okay? By the way, when we define the group does not necessarily mean the country, but you can see a group can be the nation, but a group would also be the profession, the lawyers, the doctors, the politicians, the organization, and the family. He died a few months ago. Professor Dr. Gert Hofstede is, at the age of 91, is the social scientist that has done, to me, the most remarkable work in the field of culture. And he has come up with the definition I gave you before. Culture is the collective programming of the mind, which distinguishes one group from another. It's a very important definition. Culture is like the software, like a computer, of the mind. But culture does not distinguish individuals, me from Marcelo, distinguishes groups. If we do only have two individuals, we cannot make any meaningful comparison. We can only do that if we speak about groups. So the consequences of that definition, which is very important, culture exists only by comparison. If we only had Brazilians on Earth, there would be no comparison possible. Culture is about groups, as I mentioned, not individuals. And culture is learned, is not genetic. Okay, as we discussed in the pyramid example. The key element of culture are values. Values are things that are very deep, very unconscious, and we acquire them very early. These values are connected to strong emotions, something that we see, we experience, emotions we have, and therefore they are extremely difficult to change. This is why culture is stable over time, despite the internet, despite the globalization, and despite all that. In fact, one way to explain the role of values and the connection between values, what people believe, and what people do, which is the practices, is the famous onion image, right? Like an onion, you have the outer parts, and then you go deeper and deeper, you go to the centers. Imagine when you go outside of Brazil, you go to a different country, you go to Italy, and immediately you run into symbols. Symbols is how people dress, the pictures. You look at the flag, you look at architecture, right? That might be different from you, right? Then you look at the heroes. I mean, if you go to another country, you can see, why is this person or this figure popular, right? Why do people admire that? Let me give you a little example. Think about American culture, for example. American culture through the movies, through the books. An American hero, somebody who other Americans would like to be like, would like to imitate. I'm going to ask you quick questions, and unfortunately, I cannot get the answers from you, but I'll guess. Is the hero young or old in America? Normally. Is the hero beautiful or is not important? 3, is the hero strong or weak physically? Is the hero rich or poor? Typically, not all eras. So think about what you identify. Now think about Asia now. Is the hero young or old? Poor or rich? Physically strong or not physically strong? Beautiful or not beautiful? The opposite, the answer are clearly the opposite. I took to extreme just to tell you what is it, who is it in a particular society, Italy, Brazil, America, or China, people aspire to. And as you go even deeper, closer to the center of the onions, you have rituals, how people talk, how people look at one another, how people hug one another or they don't, whether people keep eye contact or don't, if they shake hands, if they open gifts when they are exchanged, or they open gifts later, how they sit, how they dance, how they speak, how they argue, how they fight or don't, if they show emotions or they don't, right? So these things, symbols, eras, and rituals, the practices, what you see if you go to a foreign country, when you are negotiating with somebody from a foreign country, is influenced by values. So the great contribution of Professor Hofstede to our understanding of culture is that he has created many years ago, and the studies have continued to validate his research, a model, a framework for understanding national cultures that initially started with 4 dimensions, 4 criteria. I will explain you what they are. They then became 5. You see the 5-dimension model. And as of late, a few years before he died, this model came to include 6 dimensions, 6 variables that allow us to understand national cultures. I cannot explain the whole research in an hour, so forgive me if I will be quick and fast, but I just wanted to know, and you probably know this already, that there is some very solid research there that you can use. It's extremely powerful. It's not just academic. It's really something that can allow you to navigate the world, the negotiation world, much more effectively. The other image which is often used to describe culture is not just the onion like before with the outer layers and the inner part, but the iceberg. Symbols here as models and rituals, the outer part is what we see. It's like the tip of the iceberg. There is much more underneath, and that is the values. Okay, so what are these values? What do we mean by that? The culture of a group is manifested, among other things, on the distribution of values within that group, within Italy, within Brazil, within Germany. And by value, we refer to preferences. What do people prefer among certain options, right? Not about, drinking coffee with sugar or without sugar, not something of that kind. I would not call that culture, but something, state of affairs over something which is connected to very strong emotions, okay? I'm going to skip this and move to this. For example, is it okay for you as a young girl or young boy to challenge your parents when the adults are speaking? Do you have a word to say, or are you supposed to listen? In school, do you listen to your professor? Is it good to ask many questions of your professor, or is it not, right? How many people you take care of? Is your individual success the most important thing, or is the success of everyone in your family, in your group, important, right? These are the big dilemmas. And how do you relate to power? Do you need to be obedient to power? Or if you disagree with the power holder, with the boss, with the president, you can get in trouble, okay? The 5 dimensions that describe this model are now on your screen. And they have names which are difficult to understand, but I will clarify them. The first one is power distance, called PDI. The second is individualism, IDV, masculinity, mass, uncertainty avoidance, and long-term pragmatism or long-term orientation. What Professor Hofstede did many decades ago, he basically used questionnaires and asked questions, many more questions, such as the one I asked you. And he gave people who were responding to this questionnaire the chance of answering between 1 and 5. So the extent to which people agreed to questions such as, should you respect power? All right? Should you interrupt your parents? Something like that. And he was able to place almost every country in the world on a scale from 0 to 100. So the first dimension we can talk about it is this idea of power distance. Power distance refers to the extent to which in a society power is not only accepted. The boss is the boss. I cannot challenge the boss. I cannot question what the prime minister says, or I go to jail, I get in trouble, or I'm seen as somebody who does not respect authority. The extent to which people accept and expect that power is not distributed equally in a society, right? I'm missing a slide here. I'm sorry if I'm going back and forth. I wanted to give you some example. So based on this research, there are countries where power distance is very high, close to 100. This is mostly the Asian countries, right? Where you see what powers the power holders have. The president of a country can be the president for life. The president has a lot of guards, a lot of protection. The president is not accessible. In order to speak with the power holder, the big boss, you have to go through several steps. There are rituals. People even use certain words to refer to the power holder. The same is in companies, in organizations. The CEO could be called Bill, like Bill Gates, or Steve Jobs, right? Like you know him, like he's accessible, he has a first name like you, or is Mr. Professor Director General, has a lot of titles to that. So in certain cultures, the hierarchy is not only accepted, but expected as an element of life. You cannot live properly unless there is a power system in place. So all the countries in the world have been ranked based on this PDI index. The index is a score that tells you what is the position of your country in respect to that dimension, in this case, power distance. So you can have countries that are very high on power distance index, PDI, or countries that are very low. The countries that are very low, as you can bet, are all the Anglo-Saxon countries. The UK, the United States, Australia, New Zealand. You see that you can challenge the leaders. You know, there is freedom of speech. People are very informal. Even the big boss of a large organization of a country is accessible. The contrary is, for example, in Asia, where power distance is extremely high. Now, imagine for a second that you're watching as a student a meeting between a negotiator from a high power distance culture, Asia, with the low power distance culture. Two cultures that value power and hierarchy differently. So the consequences for a successful negotiation can be hierarchy itself. If you are the number 2, the number 3 in your organization, and you're meeting with number 1, that is not likely to go well, because the number 1 will expect to meet the number 1. If you are meeting with a negotiator from a low power distance culture, for example, America, they would not care what your level is, as long as you can get the deal done. If you have the power to commit your organization, that doesn't matter. Your age would be important. Your titles would be important in a high PDI culture, but it would not be that much in a low PDI culture. The use of status symbol, you know, the use of titles, the use of formalism, that would be very important for a high PDI culture, for example, in the Gulf, in the Arab world, and especially in the Gulf, right? It would not be important in other cultures. The delegation of authority. In a high PDI culture, it's harder to delegate authority because power is concentrated in one individual, right? Whereas it is very common in low PDI culture to delegate authority. So what authority do you have? And what is the perception of your authority from the other negotiators? And then respect versus disrespect towards power holders. If you come from a low PDI culture, at the negotiating table, you could change, you could propose to renegotiate even your own proposal, the proposal of your organization. You can make the counter offer. Why? Because you can do that. In a high PDI culture, a very hierarchical culture, the person at the table might not have the power to change a proposal that comes from the organization, because that is highly structured and highly rigid. Okay? This is very important to know. What is the power game in this particular context? The second variable that I like, the second dimension that I would like to introduce is called individualism. And the opposite of individualism is collectivism. In individualist societies, the society that have a high score in individualism, IDV, high score, people are supposed to look out for themselves and their direct family only. This is a highly individualistic society. It's the important thing. In the opposite societies that are highly collectivist, people belong to in-groups that are much larger than their family. And being part of these groups is important for your well-being, because you have your network, you have your own protection system. So countries that are low in individualism, as you can see, low, so they are collectivist. The word we, it's very important, much more than the word I. The opinion of the group is very important. You cannot get the group to lose face, for example, by challenging publicly the opinion on the group. Communication is very implicit, because if I say something that challenges and goes against the view of the group, I humiliate the group. So the meaning is not always clear. And it's the risk of not respecting the group rules can lead to shame. You can feel shame if you get somebody to lose face. You can lose face by contradicting somebody's opinion, by rejecting their proposal. That offer makes no sense whatsoever, right? It's too high for us. It's not serious. You say this to your counterparty, and you can generate the loss of face, okay? The opposite, of course, is on the right side. Society where individualism is high, the self is important. It's all about the competition. At the end of the month, somebody wins and somebody loses. So bonuses are paid to those who make more sales. And you go to certain stores and there is the picture, employee of the month. And there is a picture of the ones who achieve. Everything is a competition. Even when children are small, they compete to win a prize, to be the best dancer, to be the best ballerina, or to be the best player in whatever. Communication is very explicit because there is no concern about getting anybody to lose face. If you win, you win. If you lose, you lose. It's very simple. There is no humiliation there. And in highly individualistic society, when we do something wrong, that leads to guilt, which means a lot of self-respect. And this is an internal, guilt and self-respect are individual feelings. Shame and loss of face are public, are collective feelings, okay? Can you guess from this definition which societies are highly individualistic, right? Typically North America, right? Very individualistic. What does the United Nations Constitution say? The pursuit of happiness. You have a right to pursue your own happiness, right? You are out for yourself. When we mention about these things, you should not just think about negotiation and culture, but think about how these values, believing in individualism or believing in collectivism, shape our entire lives. Why do you think that Social Security pension is mostly private in the United States? Why do you think that the health system is also private? You have to pay your own insurance. In my country, for example, you have a right to go to the state hospital and get treatment, right? So institutions, the public health system, the tax system, the pension system are created around this deeply held values. It's up to you to take care of yourself. The government will not think of you otherwise. Think about helping the poor or celebrating the winners. So institutions, the rules, the laws are created around this particular value. If you think about the consequences, once again, imagine a highly individualistic negotiator meeting, a negotiator coming from a highly individualistic group, meeting with a negotiator coming from a collectivist group. You can run into issues about that. And as I will show you at the end, we mentioned North America, the Anglo-Saxon world being highly individualistic. Highly collectivist society are Asian and Latin American society, particularly. I will tell you at the end of this presentation where you can go online and really type in your country and see what is the score, what is the index of those countries you're interested in around these values. In countries where individualism is not that important, so in highly collectivist countries, for example, the relationship is much more important than the deal. When you go to China, when you go to Asia, visiting with them, spending time with them, socializing with them, it's much more important. You cannot do like in North America that you come with the contract, you get the signature, you haggle, you bargain on the price, and that's it. Also, because the relationship is so important, feeling part of a group, in most countries, oral agreements are better than written agreements because the written agreement is too binding. You cannot imagine all of the circumstances, right? Maintaining space, remember, versus maintaining self-respect. If you're negotiating with a group of Asians, right, they came to that decision presumably after consulting all of them. Everybody has a role in a company: director of marketing, the director of production, the director of legal. The position is something that comes from a collective decision. If you attack that proposal, if you are too strong in negotiation, you can make somebody in that group lose face, and that will of course not be good for your particular outcome, right? Also, in terms of negotiating, connected to what we just said, in a highly collectivist society where individualism is low, people would prefer to have a more balanced approach as opposed to spell out every single details. Why? Because if you have more room to maneuver, the problems that you have can be resolved by talking, leveraging your friendship, your interaction, rather than looking at the contract. Like an American will say, this is the contract, paragraph 2B says that you cannot do this. And somebody from a different culture could say, well, that's true, but we want to be in this relationship together. We are friends, we want to continue. Why should we fight about this? Why don't we find a solution? So on and so forth. I'm looking at time because I'm really concerned about having taken that. So let me be quick. I might be stopping earlier than this, but I want to cover at least the 4 key dimensions and then show you something which allows you to bring all this theory together. The third dimension, which is very controversial because of the terminology, is masculinity versus femininity. Despite the wording masculinity, femininity, this is not men versus women, but it refers to the predominance in a group, in a culture, of traditionally masculine values as opposed to traditionally feminine values. That doesn't mean that men are masculine and female are feminine. So you can have societies, cultures, where there are very high feminine values, and the opposite. So in culture where there is very high masculinity plus, people should be winners, not just men, people, even women. There is a great admiration for the achiever. Confrontation is common. There's confrontation and somebody wins. And even between colleagues working together, there is competition. To the contrary, in society where masculinity is low, so they are feminine, even men can adopt caring attitude. There is the sympathy for the unfortunate, and people look for consensus. And people may be independent, but they still cooperate. Okay? Cultures that are highly feminine, where there is very feminine values, are pretty important. Are, for example, all the countries from Northern Europe. They have a short working week. They take a lot of leave. Even men, the men were the first to have a parental leave, to take time from work when they have children. There is no shame if the woman is the one bringing money into the family, and if the men stay at home and do work of the sort. There is a great care of attitude for the environment, for example. And you pay a lot of taxes in Scandinavia. Why? Because the state is there to provide education, to provide health to everyone. So there is this sympathy for the unfortunate. Somebody has to be taken care of, and that is the state as a whole. Remember, before I mentioned the difference in individualism and collectivism. I mentioned the health system, but think about the education system, right? The best education is to be provided by the state, by the government, or by private institutions, right? In highly individualistic societies, we don't care. If you have a good educational product, if you're Harvard University or MIT, you can sell that education at the very high price. Why? Because people will take it. What about those who cannot afford to pay those tuition fees? Their problem. We are here to make individuals successful. And the more talent you have, the more successful you should be. And the society will support you to be that. In other societies, the emphasis is on giving everyone the same opportunities. The fourth and the last we'll talk about dimension that I want to share with you has a fancy name, and it's called uncertainty avoidance. And this dimension speaks to the extent to which people feel threatened by ambiguous situations and have created belief and even institutions to avoid uncertainties. If you meet somebody new, somebody strange, is that something, a stimulus for you? Is something that makes you curious, or something that worries you, right? How important it is to have rules, and how detailed have those rules to be? Are you willing to take risks, or risks should be controlled? Do you show your emotions at the negotiation table or in communication? And what's your general attitude toward life? Is relaxed or not relaxed? How people in that particular country taking a lot of drugs, for example, antibiotics, or before they get antibiotics, they try something else, you know, problem and remedy. Countries are scored on the uncertainty avoidance index, like for the other dimensions, in countries with low uncertainty avoidance and high uncertainty avoidance, okay? And as you can see on the screen, these countries show, these groups, a very different attitude toward uncertainty avoidance. Let me show you a proverb that you might have heard. In Germany, everything is forbidden unless it is allowed. You might have heard that. In the United Kingdom, everything is allowed unless it is forbidden. And in France or Italy, everything is allowed, even if it is forbidden, right? Now, you might have heard these things, right? So it's not me, it's not cultural anthropology, but you might get some insights about why people in these countries tend to think that way if you consider those values. Let's focus on these, and let me add China at the end. Why is it that in Germany everything is forbidden unless it is allowed? Well, because Germany has a high score on uncertainty avoidance. So when you have high uncertainty avoidance, how do you deal with uncertainty? By having a lot of rules and regulations. They give you comfort that every possible scenario is taken care of, right? But then you also have low PDI, okay? Low power distance. So there is no need for structure. But you also have high individualism. So people want to know what to do. In the UK, there is a very low score on uncertainty avoidance. Think about this. The United Kingdom is the country where constitutional law began. And yet the United Kingdom does not today have a written constitution. There is no written constitution. These are just customs, right? The United Kingdom did not feel the need to crystallize, to write down specifically the rules, not because the rules are not important, but because they need as few rules as possible. In countries like France, Italy, or Greece, there are lots of rules contradicting one another, and people don't even know. And anytime something happens, rules are put in place. When the pandemic started, Italians did not know what to do because every week the prime minister would issue 80, 90 pages long decrees saying what you can do, what you cannot do. You can meet if you have a girlfriend, but has to be at least 2 years. Otherwise, it's not a girlfriend. You can go to a relative. I mean, I'm just telling you true stories about how many rules, how much structure a culture needs. Why is it in France everything is allowed, even if it is forbidden? Because there is a very high score on uncertainty avoidance, which means a lot of rules. But there's also high power distance. And therefore, if you are in a position of power, you think that you can go beyond the rules, that you can break the rules. You can make the rules for yourself, right? High uncertainty avoidance, a lot of rules, but high power distance. If you have power, you use that power. In China, the same, it depends on who you know. You know, because there is a very high score on power distance, so the importance of knowing somebody's power, but also very low individualism. People want to be part in a group, and in a group there is flexibility to accommodate those who are part of the group. Okay, these are just broad definitions, but it shows you that there is a connection between what we have felt in Germany, that everything is regulated, and what we felt in the UK, you know, that you can do anything unless it is forbidden, and what we experience in countries like France. The consequences of dealing with a negotiator from a culture that is high or low on uncertainty avoidance are very important, right? How, for example, you establish trust. Is trust a given? We are human beings. We are both negotiators. We're both sales executive. We come from the same company. You are the negotiator for Petrobras in Brazil, and I am your colleague, a negotiator for Petrobras in Italy. Petrobras, let's assume, as a subsidiary in Italy. The fact that we work for the same company does not mean that we're going to do the same, because there will be different expectations. What is new, what is unknown, tends to be a threat. So trust is not given immediately. What about the importance of being knowledgeable? Right? If you have ever listened to a conference speech or read a German book, you will see a lot of footnotes. A German, for example, will never tell you anything without a lot of evidence. There will be citations and expertise and data and reports. Just because the Germans have a very high uncertainty avoidance, and having rules, having expert opinions validating certain positions helps them deal with that uncertainty, okay? Emotions. In countries where uncertainty avoidance is high, like Italy, for example, or Greece, or Germany, to a lesser extent, people tend to be pretty stressed out because you keep all this fear inside, right? All the stress, you're nervous, you're always worried about what might happen. And therefore, when it happens, people explode, right? You see Italians being so emotional, they scream, the Spaniards as well. But also, if you go to some Mediterranean island, you will see how people react. This is a famous example of the merger between Volvo and Renault. Volvo from Scandinavia, relatively low uncertainty avoidance, and Renault from France, high uncertainty avoidance. And when the two companies merged certain operations, it wouldn't work. And when they had joint meetings, according to the French representative of Renault, the Swedes, they were never engaged. They were never active. They were dull, like this. According to the Swedish, it was impossible to work with the French because they spoke fast. They interrupted each other all the time, and they manifested their emotions openly. They were just rude. There was just the attitude there. So I can't see clearly, unfortunately. I can move that. Yeah, the distinction that the last one you see is the practical approach as opposed to a legalistic approach. In a high uncertainty avoidance, it will all be driven and guided by what's in the contract as opposed to what is it that we can do to change things. And if you wonder what societies are very low in uncertainty avoidance, we mentioned some cultures in the West, like for example the United Kingdom, but also there will be a lot of countries in the East. So it's not really, as you can see, guided by geography. Where uncertainty avoidance is high, a country where uncertainty avoidance is high. I'm just checking my numbers here to make sure. Uncertainty avoidance is extremely high in Japan. Can you imagine why? Think about it. You live in Japan. You are in the middle of the ocean, and there can be an earthquake anytime. There could be a tsunami anytime. You know that nature is in charge. It's not you. And there's very little you can do to control uncertainty. So you keep that inside, and life is extremely stressful, right? This is as example. What is it that makes a certain culture more inclined to want rules, to want to have structure, to want to have systems? Okay. What is the very opposite of being stressed in life? Think about the Caribbean, for example. Don't worry, be happy. The weather is pretty good most of the time of the year. You live on an island. Tourism is the industry. You cannot, change much by being agitated, by being nervous, because the pace of life is different, and that has, of course, an impact on how these people will see and approach negotiation. In the interest of time, I want to finish because I understand it is too much. With the slide, which I think is very important. The slide allows you to figure out culture with what are called mental images. Meaning that there are countries you see, for example, on the left, USA, UK, Ireland, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. If you go and look at the scores, the index, and again, I will tell you where you can look them, you will see that they have similar scores. In all these countries, for example, for which the image is the idea of a contest, you have low PDI, right? So people confront one another because they have no problem doing this, because it's okay. And also they do that because individualism is very high. You fight, you have no problem. You can climb in society. It's really up to you. Everything is in your hands. Masculinity is also high in this country, meaning that people strive for success, to be rich, to have things. This is masculinity, to be a winner. And uncertainty avoidance tends to be low. So people are in favor, as you can see, of competition, autonomy. People want to have autonomy. Your employees will want autonomy, right? If you don't give them autonomy, they will not be well. Decentralization is good. Risk-taking is also okay, because it has to do with your individualism, right? And your masculinity. And the uncertainty avoidance. If you're not worried about what might happen in the future, you will take risk. And innovation, creation is also important there. Other countries and cultures, Sweden, Netherlands, Baltics, Norway, Finland, and Denmark, it's in Northern Europe. There, the mental image you want to keep in mind is the idea of a network. PDI, power distance, is low, right? Individualism is high, masculinity is high, and uncertainty avoidance is average. Okay. Let me make a correction. There is a mistake I will correct. Masculinity is not high in this culture, is actually low. Okay, so this arrow going up under mass is a mistake. It should be going down. So if these are the dimensions, the indexes, things as consensus, cooperation, decentralization, risk-taking, well-being, and reliability, and social ethics are more important. So you see there are elements that are different. Imagine a meeting. In a meeting, in a contest situation, the person with the best argument wins. The best negotiator might win, right? The person in a meeting that is more eloquent might win. Now that would not be the case in a network culture where everybody wants to be consulted. People want to cooperate and they look for consensus. Okay. Now let's focus on the third group. This is part of Europe: Germany, Switzerland, the German-speaking part, the Czech Republic, Luxembourg, Hungary, and Austria. If you look at those scores, you will see that they are similar in that PDI is low, individualism is high, masculinity is high, and uncertainty avoidance is high. So in these cultures, you need a lot of structure. Structure is necessary, but uncertainty avoidance. Autonomy is important because individualism is high. Everything has to be SOP, standard operating procedure. There's got to be structure. The risk has to be calculated. It is very important to be and to appear as an expert, right? We always say, what is the worst thing that an Italian negotiator can tell to a German negotiator, to a counterparty? You are negotiating, there's a problem, and you go, huh? I'm the Italian. Oh, I just had an idea. and you think it's a great thing. You have a solution, and the German will say, well, where does this idea come from? Who has verified this idea? Who has validated that idea, right? What is the evidence? What is the scientific proof behind the idea? This is kind of a joke, but only to a limited extent. The other thing I like in terms of the worst thing that an American negotiator would do to a Chinese, maybe not the worst thing, but one of the bad things. Americans would always ask you, what's on your mind? What do you think about this? If you ask your counterparty from Asia, Chinese, what's on your mind? That might not be a welcome question, because what's on your mind has to be run by the group. What if what's in your mind can be seen as offensive of the proposal you've just received, so you can cause that person to lose shame? What about authority? Can you share what's on your mind if you're not the boss in a society like China, which is very hierarchical, right? Things like that. So you can see that those things we feel have a basis here. Now, there are cultures, also the mental image, everything is well oiled, organized, is for these countries. The next image that we have is what's called the solar system. It's a solar system. There is a center and there are the planets. And in these cultures, like my own Italy, the northern part of Italy, Poland, Switzerland, the French-speaking part, Belgium, France, and Spain, we know that there are some similarities, right? The Italian, the French, the Spaniards, though the Italians call the French the cousins, there is something like that. We have, in fact, in the numbers, in the science, we have together high power distance, respect of authority. In Italy, we use all these titles, professor, doctor, president, it's very important to us. We have a high individualism, everybody wants to, and we want to show success. Masculinity is relatively high, and uncertainty avoidance is also high. So in this cultures, hierarchy, rules, centralization, formalization, analysis, and well-being are also important, but also honor, right? The next two, and then we're finishing, is the notion of the pyramid. Guatemala, Brazil, Russia, Turkey, South Korea, and Portugal. So you see that we are grouping together countries from different parts of the world. And I don't know if this sounds true to you, because most of you are Brazilians. The idea that hierarchy is important, but also loyalty, centralization, formality, procedures, respect, and communication relatively indirect. This is because PDI, respect of power, is high. Individualism is not that high. You, especially in Latin America, people feel that they have a responsibility for a larger group than the family. Masculinity is average, and uncertainty avoidance is high. So you also are afraid of what might happen. Okay. Lastly, I need to move this, is the family, the idea of the family. And this is essentially Asia. And hierarchy is, of course, very important there, but also loyalty, centralization. Imagine in China, there is a central, political party that controls everything, right? There's a bureau, is the center, even today. Harmony, flexibility, and indirect communication. These features, these keywords that you can expect come from high PDI, low individualism. Low individualism means high collectivism, right? Is the opposite. Masculinity, and lower uncertainty avoidance. You see, we do not have Japan here, because as I mentioned, Japan is very high in uncertainty avoidance. Before we finish off, I found this words by the very famous psychiatrist Carl Jung, that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. So enjoy and cherish the culture shock. Golden rules: when you go out, you do not have access to this data, or if you don't believe in this data, respect other people's cultures, understand that there is a rationale in why people behave, right, tend to behave. As long as you keep on judging others' behavior with your own lenses, with your own horn, you will not get the full picture. And if you don't know where to go, if you don't know what to do, show genuine interest. And the key word is genuine, which means real. If you're pretending just to be interested by somebody else's culture, that will show. Here's a snapshot at power distance if you want to understand how this value play. Where the green is the darker, power distance is higher. You can see Russia, you can see certain parts of Asia, for example, right? You can see North America. So when the green is lighter means less power distance. This is about collectivism and individualism, right? Where it is, when it is darker is more individualism. You know, United States, Australia, New Zealand, but also the UK and part of Europe, highly individualistic, right? This is about masculinity. Remember, success, material success, respect for the winner. So you see that the areas are different, and even in the same continent, you can have countries that are neighboring countries, but a very different attitude. So that shows you that to this day, we have cultural differences. This is about uncertainty avoidance, you know, where uncertainty avoidance is higher, wherever the color is darker, the dimension, in this case, uncertainty avoidance, the willingness to avoid uncertain situations is higher. And finally, a dimension we have not spoken about. Maybe this might be the slide to leave on, or we can also change that. I've taken a lot of your time, more than I wanted. So I'll stop right here and see if there are any questions, comments, or suggestions. Over to you, Marcelo and Camille.
Camille, I think it's Alexandre Simões made a reflection or a comment, and then we can have some questions. And before that, I want to thank you, Giuseppe, my old brother, because you just started, I think, in many minds here, a lot of questions, reflections, and also maybe a drive to understand better many things that you bring to us here now. Camille, I don't know if your perception is like this, but
yeah,
you are
amazing.
just thinking about all the routes that we can also begin now.
Exactly. So shall we start with the reflection that was in the chat? So yeah. Alexandre Simões made the reflection before, expressing that in fact there is an important role that cultural differences play in international negotiation. So culture profoundly influences how people think, communicate, and behave. It also affects the kinds of transactions they may make while they are in negotiation. Sorry, it also affects the kinds of transactions they make and the way they negotiate them. So this was a reflection.
Let me make a comment, very practical. This is absolutely true. And that speaks about the negotiation creativity. This is a true case that I had. There was a Brazilian negotiator from Rio. And the chairman of the meeting was a German. And the Brazilians were all, you know, full of ideas, you know, having proposals. And the German, being highly structured, also a little more senior, he just could not manage that. So the meeting was not going well. The moderator had this idea that the German chair of the meeting would use color cards. So if the color was green, the Brazilian could speak. If it was red, the Italian could speak, right? Because that gave him a sense of structure. He could manage the information. The Brazilians did not take that as an offense. They take it as a joke. And therefore, they played and started respecting the color, right? But that is what made things work. Without that simple thing, creative things, the meeting could have gone differently because people would not have been able to recognize that culture had an impact on how people speak and can receive information, as opposed to, this is stupid, you're old, you're slow, you're not imaginative, you're not creative. So very important point that was made there. Over to you, Camille.
Great. That's it. And many comments on how culture influences our perceptions and therefore the way we react to things. So if we know the other, and then connecting with what you said at the beginning, preparation. So if we know our own selves, if we know how we perceive things, and if we know beforehand who are we speaking to, then we can organize which strategy and how to frame everything we say. Right?
It's an excellent point, and not to superimpose, not to impose our values on somebody else. This is another example that I saw. This very, very famous, very rich mediator was hosting a meeting of young mediators from all over the world. And he wanted to, it was emphasizing how mediation allows everybody to speak. And then if you are in the mediation, you should really take advantage from everybody's perspective. And there was a young woman from Egypt, and she was not agreeing with this idea. And the senior American mediator wanted, I really want to know what you think. And she wouldn't speak. So the meeting didn't go well. At the end, I explained to the mediator, as much as you value gender equality, the opinion of a very young woman, unfortunately, is not something that young woman herself feels comfortable expressing in the presence of her boss without being authorized by the boss. So you're asking, young woman, I really would like to hear from you too. You think is good, makes sense, respects gender, the young woman could have a great idea. It would still be something that the woman herself was not ready to do. So I told this mediator, whatever you do in America is not necessarily going to work here. You need to prepare whom should you involve, in what order, formally or informally. You have to have a plan. You have to have a plan, and these variables, the mental images, the indexes, can really help you navigate. They are not a GPS, as precise as a GPS, but they are a map. Because remember, we are all individuals. So at the top part of the pyramid, we are unique. But even if we all studied at Harvard or we went to Oxford, right, we will still remain, to a large extent, at least the majority of us, Brazilians, Americans, Italians, Chinese. So it's very important to keep in mind.
Great. And adding to that, we just received a question in the chat. I could add to that example, because the person said, if you could confirm that these preconceptions about cultural dimensions are indeed confirmed at the negotiation table, and if have you ever expected a cultural behavior and find another one?
Oh, absolutely. Let me start with a joke. Because I'm an Italian, I have fun, and I also use my leverage, not being an Italian at the negotiation table. I arrive early. I'm never late. I'm always very prepared, and I don't show my emotions. It is possible that happens. So you don't have to be unnatural, but just educate yourself. Okay, if somebody interrupts me, it's not necessarily because he or she is rude. If somebody is listening to me patiently, that does not mean the person agrees with me. A yes in Asia might mean, yes, I hear you, not yes, I agree with you, right? If somebody's not looking at me in the eyes, it's not because he is not serious, but maybe it's because he's focusing there, okay? So you need to be able to be wrong. You need to be able to be open, not able, to the idea that you might be wrong. But you might educate yourself, let me not overreact about this. And you know your weak spots. I'm a young woman. If somebody attacks my gender, or the fact that I didn't go to an important school, or that I don't have a PhD, I'm just saying, right? You know what your weak spots are. Somebody touches it, boom, you overreact. How can you control that? The fact that you do not have a degree, the fact that you're not senior might be important in a high power distance culture. They're not bad. They're not trying to use that against you. It's their cultural imprint. So you can compensate from that. If you're the junior person, you might want to have before a meeting, an important letter being sent by your boss. Or after the meeting, your boss validates you, he introduces you. Or you can have somebody next to you who will compensate for the perception of your weakness, of something you like. So your way to compensate that is really like a design. You know, it's like painting something in that regard. Then, you know, you cannot script everything, right? You cannot script, but there are things that you should be prepared. And then if that doesn't happen, if you find an Italian who's very American, you know, very matter of fact, let's get down to business, fine, you can play that game. but don't be thrown off your game if somebody does something that you can predict he or she will do because of who they are.
Emilio, we have another interesting question from Andre Lauria.
Yeah, so he said, Giuseppe, do you think it should be interesting to apply Professor Giga's approach to research the potential differences among regions of the same country? Like in Brazil, we are a continental country,
Yeah.
so it's very interesting for us. And we also have to add on that, a continental country with differences among cultures. So in the south, we have the Germans and the Italians. In the north, it's all different cultures.
It's absolutely. If you think about Belgium, you have the Flemish speaking and the Dutch and the French. Think about Spain, right? You have the Basque. Think about Italy, northern Italy and southern Italy. That's different. That is important. In fact, in the most sophisticated cross-cultural research, a culture is not necessarily a nation. However, be mindful of what we think about culture when you think about Brazil. I'm going to make you an example. People say America is a huge country with cultural differences from all over the world. And yet, if there is something monolithic, something solid, there is one thing, is American culture. Because the American hero is the American hero in New York and in Tennessee. Yes, New York talk fast, they talk like that, coffee talk, right? Like this. Californians are more relaxed, more laid back, but what people want is the same. You have kids, you go to preschool, then there is a top school, then how much money you make, and then if you make money, you give to charities. The heroes are the same. You know, the American dream is one. And I don't know much about Brazil, but that is very important. What are the values? What do Brazilians in the South think about individualism and collectivism, right? When people say, I don't know where I am, I'm asking you this. To all of you, to how many people in your life that you know would you give without hesitation half of all the money you have if they ask you because they have a need? Is it 1? Is that 5? Is that 10? That's a way for you to measure how much, where you are on the individualism versus collectivism. I mean, just a little example. So that would be interesting to check, not how people dress, drink, talk, but what do they think about that? What about uncertainty avoidance? Do they think it is okay to pay for private education, right? In the South or in the North? And all people save for the future or they don't? How do they relate to power? Right? They all respect the president or the authority. And again, groups, not individuals. Remember, it's very important we think about groups.
Great. And before I jump into a very interesting question talking about technology, actually, let's jump to that and then we go back to another question.
I saw a question of artificial intelligence. Wow, that's a great one. These are all good questions, by the way.
Let's start with that. Let's start with the artificial intelligence one.
And what is the question is the impact of culture. Yeah.
If it's able to create tendencies.
To me, what artificial intelligence can do is scary. And I've seen examples of people negotiating with bots, with robots. So they have a catalog of responses, and based on what you say, there is that. To the extent that we identified common and key words, remember in the slides, for the family, for the solar system, hierarchy, decentralization, you could create a repertoire, like a menu of answers or phrases that you would change based on where that person comes from. It would be risky because, as we mentioned, the pyramid has 3 steps: common to all mankind, learn, and then individual. But I think that an adaptive system, if I'm the machine and I know you're Brazilian, I could start with that assumption. And as you respond or do not to certain inputs from me, I could adapt, okay, to see which one of the variables. To the extent we are using this research to identify common themes or common trends or thoughts or values that are more important because of your culture, I believe that artificial intelligence could use them, at least to a certain degree. And the artificial intelligence machine should also be genuinely curious about the other side. just the same thing, respect the culture. And the machine, to be effective, would have to ask questions to validate its assumptions, to cross-check its assumptions before continuing with that. As I mentioned, it's pretty scary what artificial intelligence can do. And if this gets closer to the military, imagine what could be, when we combine this and the military. Thanks God we're talking about negotiation today.
It's interesting that this connects to the last question we received, which is if our negotiation pattern is usually more cultural or more related to personality. So then it makes me think, when artificial intelligence comes to reading our personality through the data they gather from us, how would that be? So cultural speaking, we can get the group, as you mentioned, right? But then if we go down personality, then we can get the person itself. So then avatars, robots. So how would you respond to those?
Yeah, first of all, the personality that cannot develop in the cultural vacuum, right? So the personality would be, but imagine we look again at the pyramid, the artificial intelligence could be able to identify individual traits that are, for example, common exceptions in groups. So you can have, the Italians believe in hierarchy, in style, in centralization, and so on and so forth. But what they call the outliers, the exceptions from that group, tend to show some individual features. Those individual features could be the same that you could expect, and the AI could use when you find a similar group. So you could drill down the data through that as well. So that's why it's pretty impressive what can be done. And I believe that someone is already building this. Large corporations in the past, I knew that they were building databases. Of course, they were not as sophisticated, so that negotiating tomorrow with the same culture or with the same people would be easier for people who have already done that. Because if you're a corporation, you employ an employee or a manager, but then he goes away and he brings away with him or with her all of the negotiating experience of working with certain suppliers, certain cities, or certain countries. So that could be done, but I think the answer to the question is personality is is shaped by culture to the extent that culture is a software of the mind. And at least you can attack the majority of the tendencies while leaving the personal individual features as exceptions. But also those exceptions could be studied and grouped together too. I hope this answered, because it's a terrific question and a very difficult topic.
Amazing. And that connects to the question we had before from Alexander that said, if we had a negotiation about a sensible issue of one of the parties, how can we conduct this negotiation in a good way for both involved?
Well, it's a very good part. I mean, this can be discussed at various levels. From a communication point of view, there are subjects like nonviolent communications or challenging conversations and methodology to discuss sensible issues. From a cultural point of view, I believe that think about religious matters. Think about this negotiation between somebody who's pro-life and somebody who's pro-choice. Think about negotiation in parliament, whether the law should allow, more freedom to decide as opposed to respect the life of the newborns or the conceived kids. In those cases, the cultural lens is one of the tools that allows you to share your message in a more effective way, but also leverage your message. If you're dealing, for example, with somebody from a high uncertainty avoidance culture, to make it a sensitive point, you will have to have a lot of data. If you want to be more persuasive, you would have to have expertise. You might be the expert, but not being seen as an expert. So you can anticipate the cultural expectations on the other side, because you already have an uphill battle. You're talking about something very tough, and you don't want culture to be an obstacle. Culture can tell you, how can I deliver this very hard message in a way that has more chances of being received? And so you want to think ahead, preparing once again about the cultural expectations of the other side. The more difficult the subject matter, right, the sensitive issue, the less you should leave to improvisation in terms of who, how, when, and where I should deliver that message. Who, how, when, and where. The what is you, it's what you need to say, but you need to think strategically about that. Is it going to be at a formal meeting or an informal meeting? Yeah, in a high collectivist society, it may be at an informal meeting. The big decision in Asia in meetings are never taken in the boardroom. They're taken outside, because in the boardroom, somebody could be shamed, somebody could lose face. So it is highly staged. All happens before in the corridors. So when you go there, it's just a celebration of a tough negotiations that takes place outside. So these are all the things you might want to consider to give your message more chances. But you will never get a pro-life and a pro-choice person to agree. At some point, the decision has to be made. Yes, you can stop the pregnancy between 12 weeks, provided that, but that requires a decision.
Great.
Camille,
Yes.
can I have change the order?
Sure.
All this discussion about artificial intelligence and things like that. In an opinion, what separates human and machines? Empathy, rapport, what is in charge here?
Well, first of all, I must say that I'm really not an expert. I should do a little more readings about this, so don't take me with 3 or 4 grains of salt. The things that strikes me is the computing ability. The machine has the ability to compute more and more data, right? So that's clearly, we're losing that. When jobs will disappear, they will disappear because of that. So the question becomes, especially for us in the dispute resolution field, negotiation, mediation, can you make a catalog of behaviors also based on cultural inputs and use them? I think the answer is yes. It might take time. It may take a lot of adaptations, but we will go to a place where at least certain basic interactions, imagine a customer who calls, who's very unsatisfied for the TV service, right? That can be handled to a large extent by a machine. What might happen, maybe I hope will happen, is just because so many computational basic functions will be taken over by machine, that we could develop more and more as a way to compensate the emotional intelligence and try to outrun the machine all the time. So there will be a level of sophistication in the human mind that will be like a race between the machine and the human mind. That said, I'm not looking at something that will happen anytime soon. There is this closeness, there is this togetherness that especially the pandemic has brought. And I see not only the difference that I feel I make when I speak, when I teach, like today, but when I mediate. So there is that aspect of the biological elements of negotiation and of communication that might be hard for the machine to match ever. So what I'm trying to say, I cannot imagine that my being with a robot, unless it's an avatar, would give you the same feeling that I'm being heard, that I'm making an impact, that I'm persuading somebody. So that has a long way to go. But we can only hope that we'll be able, with something which is the harder thing for the machine to do, which is the empathy, the emotional side, we can win that battle. Because at the level of information gathering, computation, remembering what year the Pope died, or what was the 3rd emperor of Rome, that is a lost battle from the beginning. So we should focus on something else.
Great. And connecting back to culture, we had 2 questions. So the first one was regarding, especially in open immigration countries like Canada and so, if you think inherited values, cultures are changing, not only because immigration, but also globalization, with what these values and behaviors can change or interfere in negotiations then.
Well, that's a very good question. As I mentioned at the beginning, despite the globalization, we still have these values, and especially because when immigrants come, depending on the age when they come, right? What is the exposure they have? By the age of 8 to 10, these values are already in us, you know? So if you move to another country but spend a lot of time with the people from your culture, you will remain exposed to certain values, right? When you go to school and become older, what happens is that we can adapt. I mean, if I'm going to Syria, right? I move to Syria and I move with a young child, 8 to 10 or 14 years old, they will adapt to the local culture there, which is different. However, something will always feel weird, because one thing is cultural adaptation and one thing is cultural acceptance, in terms of really seeing something as normal as opposed to something strange. That is very important, especially for us international organizations. Some people find it extremely stressful to work in a multicultural environment, because all the things you do at home that you can navigate blind, you know that you can say that, you can stretch that joke, you can make that comment, because 90% of the people would understand that that's the joke, or if it is a bad joke, it's bad but not that bad. You have the parameters. You go by the millimeter, not by the centimeter. When you work in an international organization, you have to go by the yard or by the meter, because you never know what a comment, what a look, what an observation may cause. And that is highly stressful for people. People have told me that when they go to work in not just the UN, but in an international organization, it's like in the morning they need to put on a plastic armor, an armor of plastic, right? And stay inside that every day to make sure not to offend anybody and not also to be offended. So what I'm trying to say, there is more exposure when immigrants come in. People learn new values. They have to go by these new values. However, you will always feel, or people tend to feel, even after many years, that there's something strange. Look what happens to a lot of people that move abroad for work. They go to work abroad because there's better opportunities, better school, better jobs. And what do they do when they can, when they retire? They go back to their home country. That's where it feels better. And you can say it's sad, right? The most productive years of your life, you've been in a different place because you wanted to give your children more opportunities. There were better jobs. You like the political system better. But where your heart is really in that place. In fact, that's where you go when you can. Or people speak multiple languages, but when they're in trouble, one language or even one dialect will emerge. That's your default mode. What you've learned, what is more comfortable to you. So you can always adapt, you can learn, but it's like the fire under the ashes, right? There is still the fire burning, because those values, you learn them in such a moment and have such an impression on you. So yeah, that's, I think, is the comments I have about the question.
Great. And then we had a question about when you talked about mediation. So we had a question, do you have any specific message for lawyers who usually advocate in mediations?
Well, it really changes a great deal as to whether you are advocating in a domestic environment, right? In a, I wouldn't call it monoculture, but more identifiable culture or subcultures like Brazil, as opposed to internationally. I cannot advise you how. The advice that is generally valid is that being an advocate, trying to negotiate a deal through a mediator, is something very different from trying to negotiate a deal to obtain a result for your client in court. So the way you negotiate, the way you argue, the way you make proposal, and the way you respond to proposal should be very, very different. Mediation, cross-cultural mediation, becomes fascinating because to the extent that mediation has a greater structure, for example, not just two people, but three, that structure is impacted by how people are culturally shaped. You know, who should be at the meeting? Should there be a pre-meeting? Will be the meeting decisive, or will there be an approval later on, right? So all these elements are there. So the advice I would give if you are advocating in mediation with parties from other cultures, you can do in Brazil, but you have an Italian client, for example, you can still look up the dimensions of the Hofstede research to have some sort of anticipation about the process choices. Will be the decision maker at the table, yes or no? Very likely to be the case if you have low power distance culture, not the same if you have a high power distance culture. Individualism or collectivism, how many people do you want in the mediation? You want to advocate by looking at the boss, or you want to advocate by looking at somebody else? You want to involve the junior people, or you want to ignore them? These are all the variables that would come into play as we discuss. But it's a very broad question, so they would have to really, domestic or international, everybody domestic or everybody international, and so on and so forth.
Great. And then connecting back to the power of distance, individualism, this cultural aspects, a question that raised was, how would you connect those power of distance, individualism, collectivism, masculinity, uncertainty, avoidance with the juridical system per culture? So how would those influence the juridical system itself?
Absolutely. I mean, think about common law versus civil law. In common law, there's our precedents. We don't have written rules. The fewer rules, the better, right? As opposed to a code, which is very detailed. The culture that has the highest uncertainty avoidance is Greece. And if you think about the mythology, in Greece, in Greek mythology, before Kronos, the god of time, the world was run by chaos. That's the idea. You have to have structures and rule in place. And when you have lots of regulations, then you find way to change the regulations, right? So the level of details of the juridical system is also influenced by the culture, but also the nature of the judicial system. In cultures where, for example, the Supreme Court, like mine, has many, many divisions, even a decision by the Supreme Court can be confusing because another division of the Supreme Court might have a different opinion. So you have to have an en banc, a particular body where the conflicts between decisions are addressed. So there is a significant impact in that. Remember, the questions we're trying to address through culture are fundamental questions in our lives, right? How do we deal with nature? Tsunami, thunders, earthquakes. And that is, uncertainty avoidance. How do we deal with power? And that's politics. And then how do we deal with the end of our lives? And that's religion. These are ways that we deal with the fundamental questions in life. And these are all shaped by the values in a particular context. And the legal system is a way to protect us from one another. Technology will protect us from nature. The law will protect us from one another. So if we have systems, we are doing that to ensure our well-being through the systems. And if I believe that everything which is new, which is strange, is a danger, my legal system will give me certain prerogatives. To the extent, if I'm curious, if I'm risk-taking, the legal system will encourage that, right? Will facilitate research. Think about the impact of intellectual property rights. Should they be open to everyone? Should after a number of years they should be available because they contribute to the common good? But what about the remunerating, compensating the intelligence and the efforts and the investment made by those who came up with that idea, right? So there is also that. I do not have the data with me, but there is a very interesting research about what cultures have produced the most Nobel Prize. So certain people are very good at producing ideas, but in terms of producing innovations, there are other cultures. So even that really shapes how the research and the thinking is going. So I need to remind myself because this is a very important example. You can really look, how many people won this particular Nobel Prize? may not be a coincidence that a lot of people do that, because that kind of theoretical research is stimulated. The other thing you want to look is the economics. Where is the economy going better? In high power distance, in low power distance, where there is a lot of organized crime. Typically, that is in cultures where there is high power distance, the boss, right? And there is a collectivist society, because a collectivist society must be run by somebody, right? So in Asia, in countries like Italy, southern part of Italy, when you have a high degree of collectivism and high power distance, what happens? Somebody's going to be in charge, and people are going to exchange loyalty for acceptance of the rules. And so you might have the state, but you also may have a parallel system where people look for comfort, look for money, look for justice. When justice is not served by the tribunal, you find a different way to obtain what you want. So you can really mix and match these variables and identify why this is prominent there, why this is less important there, and why we have this regions, Northern Europe, Latin America, that share certain features, but not always same. Is not, as we saw with this picture, driven by geography.
Great. And then in the interest of time, we have a final question, and then you could address this question together with your final message, because it will connect what you're talking about culture, and then also what Marcelo talked at the end of the opening ceremony, where he said that collaboration is the driver for the new normal, that now the pandemic has brought us a new normal, but in order for this new normal to be born, we would need something. And we were talking about the ODSs, the Millennium Goals of the UN, and then we talked about how collaboration would maybe be the key, and connecting finally to something that someone asked, how can we change from one situation to another? So is it possible that a culture evolves, let's say, from one individualism to collaboration, or how would be your view and your experience, of course, being at the UN for so long? How would you leave the message on this point?
I start from the last part, and then I want to say something echoing what Marcelo said. I believe because of how culture develops, I believe it's hard for that to develop, at least in a short spanning of time. But if we become more aware of these cultural differences and we start looking at them not as being weird, but being logical, natural, then we can still collaborate better. It's not the unification of the culture as much as the mutual understanding and respect to be important. And look, I've been doing this work for many years and teaching since 1995, as Marcelo mentioned, and yet I still experience the culture shock when I go to places, and I react negatively, and I say, what an idiot am I? I should know better. And so it's very easy to understand, to be eloquent about cultural differences, and negotiation is very hard to do it. The other thing I wanted to mention is that, and it's not a sweet sugar-coated message for all the students here, and I saw some names of very senior professionals, friends of mine here, that your work is really important. And I'm not saying this to be nice, for you to have a nice memory of me, because recently I was at a conference and somebody mentioned that conflict, misunderstanding, and therefore mediation, negotiation is a growth industry. It's likely to be more, no less, in the future. And the reason is because, more interconnected world, and as soon as the pandemic stops, we will be even more, there will be like a desire to travel more. Every organization needs to become more and more flat. You cannot be an Italian company with all its infrastructure and all its internal culture and go from Italy to France, from France to Germany. As we go global to look for new employees, new suppliers, new partners, new customers, organizations, even the UN, when it tries to, get more people to contribute to its mission, it needs to become flatter. So that means more interaction, more difficult conversations, more conversations and negotiations affected by culture, and therefore more need for creative problem solvings, cultural awareness, and effectiveness in what are mistakenly called soft skills. These are the hardest skills to learn last night I finished at 1 o'clock. I was giving a seminar in Asia, and I said to the group, what do you think are the most popular courses today in a famous business school? Negotiation, communication, effectiveness. What do you think was 50 years ago? Check out the program of the top business schools. It's the same. Despite artificial intelligence, I believe they will be the same. It's hard for us as human beings. So you are in the good sector. There will be more demand of that. You, the participants, and those of you like Marcelo and others, coaches, or professors, or teachers, evangelists of this particular topics, I expect you to have more and more business for you. So it's good to have people exposed to this concept, attentive, curious, and tomorrow putting all these theories, as my title goes, into practice.
Thanks, Giuseppe. I think with that, we leave the message to all participants of what we are jointly doing. So this event is in order to foster this mentality, to foster negotiation as a technique for relationships. And thank you so much for your class, because culture, and mainly going back to what you said before, culture is what shapes our perception. And at the end of the day, perception is what shapes our behavior. So thank you so much for your greatness, intelligence, and being able to share it with us. It was a great class. Marcelo, if you want to say some words to your brother.
And I changed my name just for the...
It wasn't only a master class. It was a really gift that you gave to us. And also, I think it's a historical one, because this is recorded, and probably it will be maybe a point, really a point of knowledge for all the INC participants, and also for us in the meeting. We will send you also the chat here, and you see the impact. People are grateful, like us. Thank you very much.